Welcome back to the channel. Turn off the lights, settle in, and make sure your doors are securely locked. If you enjoy real, disturbing stories like the ones we're about to dive into tonight, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone who loves late-night horror. And before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and whether you've ever experienced something you still can't explain. Let's get started. I didn't realize I was trapped inside the building with him until I noticed the muddy footprints. And the truly terrifying part, they weren't leading toward the front door to leave. They were leading away from it, heading straight into the dark employee hallway behind me. This happened about 4 years ago, back when I was 22. I was putting myself through college and desperately needed a job that would let me study while paying my rent. I ended up taking the night auditor position at a small independent motel right off a desolate, empty stretch of Interstate 80 in Nevada. If you've never driven that stretch of I-80 at night, it's hard to explain just how isolating it is. There are no streetlights, no nearby towns, just an endless ocean of black desert, broken only by the occasional headlights of a long-haul trucker passing miles away. The motel itself was a relic from the 1980s. It only had 20 rooms laid out in an L shape around a cracked asphalt parking lot. My domain was the main lobby, a small, brightly lit square building detached from the guest rooms. I sat behind a thick pane of bulletproof glass separated from the front doors by a small waiting area with a cheap leather couch and a vending machine. For the first 3 months, it was the perfect job. I'd show up at 11 p.m., run the daily financial reports, lock the heavy magnetic front door at exactly midnight, and spend the rest of the night reading my textbooks or watching movies. Most nights we were completely empty. I loved the isolation. I loved the absolute silence of the desert. But one Tuesday in late November, that silence stopped being comforting. It was a strange night from the start. Around 1 a.m., a thick, freezing fog rolled off the plains. It was so dense that I could barely see the glowing neon vacancy sign sitting just 20 feet from the lobby windows. The temperature plummeted, and the old building started groaning and popping as the wood contracted in the cold. By 2:25 a.m., I was fighting to stay awake. I had my head buried in an economics textbook, the hum of the vending machine lulling me to sleep. That's when I heard it. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It was the distinct sound of heavy tires rolling slowly over the loose gravel near the edge of our parking lot. I looked up at the security monitors mounted to my left. The camera covering the entrance was grainy, distorted by the fog and the cheap lens, but I could clearly see a dark, beat-up sedan idling near the edge of the property line. Its headlights were completely off. I sat up straight, watching the screen. Usually, when someone pulls in that late, they immediately park under the canopy and rush inside to get a room. But this car just sat there. I couldn't make out the make or model, and the tinted windows made it impossible to see inside. I watched the monitor for a full 2 minutes. The car didn't move, the driver didn't get out. The engine just kept running, a low, faint rumble vibrating through the cold night air. I figured it was just someone pulling over to sleep off the road, or maybe checking their GPS. I went back to my book, trying to ignore the creeping feeling of unease settling in my stomach. About 15 minutes passed. The hum of the engine had faded into the background noise. I was just starting to relax again when a new sound shattered the quiet of the lobby. I froze. My eyes darted to the large glass windows to my right. The fog was pressing against the glass like a solid gray wall. I couldn't see anything outside. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and it sounded like it was coming from something hard, like a coin or a key striking the glass right at eye level. There were no trees near that window, no branches that could blow in the wind. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I reached under the desk and hit the button to turn on the exterior floodlights, flooding the sidewalk outside with blinding white light. I leaned forward, pressing my face close to the bulletproof glass, trying to peer out. The sidewalk was completely empty. I quickly glanced back up at the security monitors. The dark sedan that had been idling at the edge of the lot was gone. I let out a shaky breath. Just a prank, I told myself. Some teenagers from the next town over trying to scare the night shift guy. But as I leaned back in my chair, my eyes drifted from the windows to the heavy glass front doors of the lobby. My heart skipped a beat. The heavy magnetic lock at the top of the doorframe, the one I had engaged at midnight, was glowing red instead of green. The door was slightly open. A cold draft was blowing into the lobby, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and sagebrush. Someone had wedged a small, dirty piece of gravel into the door jamb, preventing it from latching shut. Panic hit me like a physical punch. I had checked that door myself. The only way it could be propped open is if someone had slipped in while I was distracted by the tapping on the window. I stood up slowly. The lobby was dead silent. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Can I help you?" Nothing. Not a sound. That's when I looked down at the cheap beige tile floor of the waiting area. Leading from the front door, faint, wet footprints were stamped onto the tiles, but they didn't walk toward the front desk where I was sitting. They bypassed the desk completely. They moved sharply to the left, heading down the narrow, unlit hallway that led to the employee break room, the public restrooms, and the maintenance closets. Someone was inside the building with me, and they were hiding in the dark. I reached under the desk and grabbed the heavy 6-cell Maglite flashlight we kept next to the cash drawer. It was thick metal, heavy enough to do some serious damage if I needed to swing it. I knew I should just call the police, but we were 20 miles out of the county sheriff's jurisdiction. Response time would be at least 30 minutes. I needed to know if there was an actual threat back there, or if a confused guest had just wandered in looking for a vending machine or a bathroom. I unlocked the security door behind the desk and stepped out into the main lobby. The air felt suffocatingly cold. I raised the heavy flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dim lighting of the lobby as I walked slowly toward the mouth of the back hallway. "Hey," I said, trying to sound authoritative. "You can't be back here. The lobby is closed." Silence. Just the low hum of the vending machine behind me. I followed the wet footprints down the hall. They were getting fainter as the moisture dried, but I could still track them. They went past the men's restroom, past the women's restroom, past the employee break room. They stopped dead in front of the door at the very end of the hall, the maintenance closet. The door was slightly ajar, maybe by an inch. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening. I could hear the faint sound of the motel's water heater humming inside the closet, but nothing else. I reached out with the tip of my heavy flashlight and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly on the hinges. I swept the game of light rapidly around the room. It hit shelves stacked with bleach, spare towels, toilet paper, and a large utility sink. The room was completely empty. I let out a massive sigh of relief, lowering the flashlight. The adrenaline began to drain out of my legs, feeling like jelly. I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. The footprints were probably from an employee who had mopped earlier, and I just hadn't noticed them until now. I turned around to walk back to the safety of my bulletproof desk. But as I took my first step back down the hallway, my foot kicked something soft lying on the ground. I shined my light down.
My breath caught in my throat. It was my own backpack. The navy blue backpack I had left sitting on a chair behind the locked front desk just 30 minutes ago. It was lying open on the floor. Every single zipper had been violently torn open. My textbooks were thrown across the tile. My spare clothes were scattered. My wallet, my car keys, and my cell phone were completely gone. Someone hadn't just snuck in. They had been behind the desk. They had taken my only means of communication and my only way to escape. Before I could even process the absolute terror of that realization, a loud mechanical clack echoed through the building. The main breaker had been thrown. Every single light in the lobby, the hallway, and the exterior canopy instantly shut off. I was plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. The only light was the narrow beam of my flashlight shaking in my hand. I froze, pressing my back against the cold cinder block wall of the hallway. I couldn't hear the vending machine anymore. I couldn't hear the neon sign. I couldn't hear anything except my own jagged breathing. And then from the pitch-black void of the lobby, from the exact spot behind the front desk where I had been sitting just moments ago, I heard a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a low, raspy chuckle, followed by a man's voice whispering into the dead silence. "You shouldn't have left the glass." I didn't think. Instinct completely took over. I didn't run toward the front desk. I sprinted in the opposite direction, toward the emergency exit at the back of the hallway. I slammed my body against the crash bar of the metal door. It burst open, and I threw myself out into the freezing, foggy night. I didn't have my car keys. I didn't have my phone. I just started running. I ran blindly through the desert brush, parallel to the highway, tearing my hands and face on the thorny bushes in the dark. I ran for almost 3 miles before a long-haul trucker saw me stumbling near the shoulder of the road and pulled over to help me. The state troopers arrived at the motel about 45 minutes later with their guns drawn. They cleared the building, room by room. The man was gone. My wallet, keys, and phone were left neatly on the center of the front desk. But it wasn't a random robbery. When the police inspected the maintenance closet at the end of the hall, they noticed something strange about the drop ceiling tiles. One of them was slightly out of place. They brought in a ladder and pushed the tile up. In the dark crawl space between the ceiling and the roof, directly above where I had been standing just moments ago, they found a crude, horrifying nest. There were empty food wrappers from our vending machine, bottles of urine, and a filthy sleeping bag. They also found a small hole meticulously drilled through the drywall, giving the crawl space a perfect, unobstructed view of the front desk. Someone hadn't just walked in that night. He had been living in the ceiling for weeks, watching me every single night, waiting for the one moment I finally felt brave enough to step out from behind the bulletproof glass. And to this day, they have no idea who he was. After that night, I didn't think anything could scare me again. Until I heard what happened to the next person.
I was supposed to be completely alone out there, miles away from the nearest paved road. So when I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy, wet boots squeaking on the hardwood floor directly beneath my bedroom, I knew my life was in immediate danger. This happened during the late fall, roughly 3 years ago. I was working freelance as a graphic designer, which meant I could work from anywhere as long as I had a decent Wi-Fi connection. To save on rent, I took a month-long house-sitting job for a wealthy older couple who were traveling across Europe. The property was a massive, beautifully restored Victorian house sitting on 40 acres of dense, overgrown timberland in rural Oregon. When I say rural, I mean isolated. The driveway alone was 2 miles of winding gravel. The nearest neighbor was a 20-minute drive away, and the closest actual town was 45 minutes out. It was the kind of place where, at night, the darkness is absolute. You can't see your hand in front of your face once the sun goes down. For the first few days, it was a dream. I'd wake up early, make coffee, sit out on the wraparound porch wrapped in a blanket, and just listen to the wind moving through the massive pine trees. I'd work during the day, take long hikes on the property lines in the afternoon, and read by the fireplace at night. It was perfectly quiet, perfectly safe. Until the 6th night. The unsettling feeling didn't start with a jump scare. It started with tiny things that make you question your own memory before you ever suspect someone else. It began in the kitchen. I had a very specific routine. I'd make a pot of coffee, pour a mug, and leave the glass carafe on the warming plate. But that afternoon, when I walked back into the kitchen for a refill, the coffee pot wasn't on the machine. It was sitting in the sink, thoroughly washed and placed upside down on the drying rack. I stood there staring at it for a good minute. I tried to convince myself that I had just gone into autopilot and washed it without realizing. It happens, right? You zone out and do chores. I shook it off and went back to work. But the next morning, the unease escalated. The house had heavy, solid oak exterior doors. The front door had an old-fashioned brass deadbolt that required physical effort to turn. I am a deeply paranoid person when it comes to locking doors. I specifically remembered checking the deadbolt before I went upstairs to sleep. I remembered feeling the heavy clunk of the metal sliding into the doorframe. When I came downstairs the next morning to grab the newspaper off the porch, the deadbolt was unlocked. Not standing open, just unlatched. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Old houses settle, sure. Wood expands and contracts, but a heavy brass deadbolt doesn't just twist itself open. I spent that entire day on edge. I walked the perimeter of the house, checking the windows, looking for forced entry. Every single window was locked tight. There were no footprints in the soft mud outside, no signs of tampering. I told myself I was letting the isolation get to my head. When you're entirely alone in a massive, creaky house in the middle of the woods, your brain starts inventing threats. I double-checked every lock that night, wedged a heavy wooden dining chair under the front doorknob just to be safe, and finally managed to get to sleep. Then came the 6th night. A massive, violent thunderstorm rolled through the valley around 10 p.m. The rain was deafening, hammering against the metal roof of the Victorian house like a drum line. The wind was howling so loudly it sounded like a freight train passing right outside the windows. I was sitting in the living room on the ground floor, wrapped in a blanket on the sofa, watching a movie with the volume cranked up to drown out the storm. At exactly 11:15 p.m., the power went out. The television died. The lamps snapped off. The hum of the refrigerator faded into nothing. The house was instantly plunged into suffocating, pitch-black darkness. I stood completely still on the couch, waiting for my eyes to adjust. They didn't. There was no moonlight coming through the windows. The storm outside was a solid wall of black water. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and turned on the flashlight. The harsh white beam cut through the dark room, casting long, distorted shadows against the antique floral wallpaper. I checked my signal. 0 bars. The storm had completely knocked out the local cell tower. I was entirely cut off from the world. I stood slowly, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The breaker box was in the basement, but there was no way I was going down into an unfinished basement in the pitch black. I decided I would just go upstairs to the master bedroom, lock the door, and sleep it off until morning.
I took 2 steps towards the main staircase in the hallway, and that's when my blood froze in my veins. Over the deafening sound of the rain hitting the roof, I heard a sound coming from the 2nd floor. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. They were coming from the guest bedroom directly above the living room. I stopped breathing. The flashlight trembled in my hand. I told myself it was just the house settling in the wind, but then the footsteps moved. They paced slowly across the ceiling, moving from the guest room towards the upstairs landing. Someone was up there. Someone heavy. Panic seized my chest. The owners were thousands of miles away. I was miles from the nearest road. There was absolutely no logical reason for a human being to be walking around on the 2nd floor of this locked house. I instantly shut off my flashlight, plunging myself back into total darkness. If they were at the top of the stairs, any light from below would give away my exact position. I stood frozen in the dark hallway, listening. The footsteps reached the top of the main wooden staircase. They paused. For 30 agonizing seconds, there was absolute silence inside the house, save for the rain outside. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs so violently I thought the intruder might hear it. Then the first stair creaked under an immense weight. They were coming down, slowly, methodically, like they had all the time in the world. I had to move. The front door was 20 feet away, but I had wedged a heavy chair under the knob. It would take too much noise and time to move it in the dark. My only option was the coat closet beneath the staircase. I backed up slowly, sliding my bare feet across the hardwood floor. I reached behind me, grabbed the cold brass knob of the closet door, and eased it open just as the heavy footsteps reached the bottom landing. Through the angled wooden slats of the closet door, I had a narrow, fragmented view of the hallway. A figure stepped into my line of sight. Even in the pitch black, I could see his silhouette when a faint flash of lightning illuminated the windows for a fraction of a second. It was a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a dark, soaking wet raincoat. But what terrified me most wasn't his size. It was the fact that he wasn't carrying a flashlight. He didn't need one. He moved through the pitch-black house with absolute, terrifying familiarity. He knew exactly where the tables were. He knew exactly which floorboards creaked. He walked slowly past my hiding spot and headed straight into the kitchen. I pressed both hands over my mouth, forcing myself to take shallow breaths silently through my nose. From the kitchen, I heard a sound that made my stomach drop into a bottomless pit.
The slow metallic scraping of a large kitchen knife being pulled from the heavy wooden butcher block on the counter. He hadn't come to rob the place. He was hunting. I heard his wet boots squeak against the kitchen linoleum as he turned around. He began walking back down the hallway, directly toward the closet where I was hiding. Every step felt like an eternity. I pressed my back against the winter coats hanging behind me, trying to make myself as small as possible. He stopped, right in front of the closet door. He was less than 2 feet away from me. Only an inch of slanted wood separated us. I could hear his breathing. It was heavy, wet, and ragged, like a dog panting in the heat. The smell of wet wool, damp earth, and something metallic, like old copper, wafted through the slats. He stood there, perfectly still, for almost a full minute. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to God he would just walk past. And then he leaned forward, putting his face inches from the wooden slats, and whispered in a voice so raspy it barely sounded human, "I know you're not the owners." My heart stopped. Before I could even process the words, he violently slammed his fist into the louvered door. The wood splintered inward, a sharp shard missing my face by a fraction of an inch. Pure survival instinct took over. I didn't scream. I just shoved the door outward with every ounce of strength I had in my legs. The heavy wooden door hit him square in the chest, throwing him backward onto the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. I burst out of the closet, didn't even look down at him, and sprinted for the back door in the kitchen. I fumbled with the deadbolt in the dark, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn it. I threw the door open and sprinted out into the blinding, freezing rain. I didn't run down the driveway. I knew he could catch me on the open road. I dove straight into the dense, thorny woods, running blindly through the mud and brush in the pitch black. I ran until my lungs felt like they were bleeding. I hid in a muddy ravine for 6 hours until the sun finally came up and the storm passed. I walked 5 miles through the woods to the nearest county road and flagged down a utility truck. When the county sheriff's deputies searched the property later that morning, the man was long gone. But they found something in the house that still keeps me awake at night. They figured out how he got in without leaving footprints or breaking locks. He didn't break in during the storm. In the master bedroom upstairs, the police found a section of the heavy oak floorboards hidden beneath an oversized Persian rug. The boards had been meticulously pried up and refitted with makeshift hinges. Underneath the floorboards was a hollow pitch-black crawl space between the ceiling of the living room and the floor of the bedroom. Inside that pitch-black, suffocating space, they found a sleeping bag. They found dozens of food wrappers from the pantry, and they found photographs, Polaroids of the older couple sleeping, and 5 separate photographs of me sitting on the porch reading my book. He had been living inside the floors of that house for months, coming out at night while we slept, eating our food, washing the dishes, unlocking the doors so he could come and go. He was never caught. By the way, if you've made it this far into the video, comment the word awake below. I'm curious how many people are still listening and how many of you are already checking the locks on your doors. Let's move on to our final story. If I hadn't looked in my rearview mirror at that exact fraction of a second, I wouldn't be alive to tell you this story. I would just be another missing person flyer taped to the window of a dusty gas station. This happened in the late summer of 2019. I was making a cross-country move from Chicago back to my hometown in Arizona. I had everything I owned packed into the back of my mid-sized SUV. I've always had a habit of driving straight through the night to avoid traffic. I actually preferred it. It was just me, an endless playlist of podcasts, a giant thermos of black coffee, and the hypnotic rhythm of the highway lines flashing by. By the time I hit the New Mexico-Arizona border area, it was roughly 3:30 a.m. If you've never driven through the American Southwest in the dead of night, it is difficult to accurately describe the absolute, crushing darkness of it. There are no streetlights. There are no houses. Beyond the immediate reach of your headlights, the desert is just a black, infinite void. You feel like you're driving through space. I hadn't seen the taillights of another car for over an hour. I was cruising along Interstate 40, fighting off that heavy, dull fatigue that settles behind your eyes right before dawn. The cab of my car was quiet, softly illuminated by the amber glow of the dashboard. I was entirely in the zone. And then the automated voice of my GPS shattered the silence. Route change detected. Major road closure ahead. Please take the next exit. I blinked, shaking off my sleepiness, and glanced at the screen mounted to my windshield. A bright yellow detour route had suddenly overwritten my straight path down the highway. I frowned. It was incredibly annoying, but not entirely uncommon. Out in the desert, flash floods can wash out sections of the highway, or a major semi-truck accident can shut down miles for hours.
The GPS was directing me to exit in exactly 1 mile. I checked my fuel gauge. I had just over half a tank, enough to handle a detour. I flipped on my turn signal and took the exit. There were no orange construction barrels, no flashing warning signs, just a simple, unlit off-ramp that dumped me onto a dark 2-lane county road. Continue for 8 miles, the GPS instructed. I followed the road. Almost immediately, the smooth pavement transitioned into old, cracked asphalt. Then 2 miles later, the asphalt completely vanished, giving way to heavily rutted, packed dirt and loose gravel. The transition was jarring. My tires kicked up a massive cloud of pale dust that glowed red in my taillights. I slowed down to 30 miles an hour. The brush on either side of the dirt road was growing taller, creeping closer to the edges of the path. Tall, dead sagebrush and skeletal mesquite trees scraped against the passenger side doors. I checked my phone sitting in the cup holder. No service, not even a single bar. A sudden sharp spike of anxiety hit the back of my neck. I was miles off the interstate, driving down a dark dirt path in the middle of absolute nowhere, completely disconnected from the world. But I told myself to just trust the navigation. The GPS had a satellite lock. It knew where it was taking me. I kept driving. 5 miles, 6 miles. The road kept getting narrower. The ruts in the dirt were getting deeper, forcing my SUV to bounce violently. I had to grip the steering wheel with both hands just to keep the car straight. At the 7-mile mark, I saw something in the distance ahead of me. Reflectors. They caught my high beams of my headlights, glowing bright silver in the dark. I let out a sigh of relief. Finally, a road sign, maybe a warning for an upcoming intersection that would take me back to the highway. But as I drove closer, my relief vanished, replaced by a cold, primal dread. They weren't road signs. They were low to the ground, too low. I eased my foot on the brake pedal, bringing the SUV to a slow, grinding halt about 30 feet away. Stretched completely across the width of the narrow dirt road was a massive, thick industrial logging chain. It was wrapped tightly around 2 thick wooden telephone poles on either side of the road, secured with heavy steel padlocks.
The reflectors I'd seen were strips of reflective tape wrapped around the center of the chain. It was a dead end. I sat there, the engine idling loudly in the desert silence. My headlights illuminated the heavy metal links of the chain. Dust drifted slowly through the beams of light. This wasn't a standard construction detour. The county doesn't use logging chains to block roads. They use orange barricades. This was deliberate. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I felt a sudden suffocating feeling of claustrophobia, despite being out in the open desert. Something was very, very wrong. I immediately shifted the car into reverse. I was going to back up, turn around, and drive as fast as I could back to the interstate. But as I looked up into my rearview mirror to check the space behind me, my breath hitched in my throat. A massive, dark shape had silently pulled up directly behind my car. It was a large, heavy-duty dually pickup truck. Its headlights were completely off. The engine was so quiet I hadn't even heard it approach over the sound of my own idling car. It was parked perfectly horizontally across the narrow dirt road, blocking my only exit. I was boxed in. The heavy chain was in front of me, the dense rocky brush was on either side of me, and a 3-ton truck was blocking my rear. Panic exploded in my chest. I slammed my hand down on the electronic door locks. The heavy thwack of all 4 doors locking simultaneously echoed in the cabin. I stared into the rearview mirror. For a long, agonizing minute, absolutely nothing happened. The dark truck just sat there, blending into the night sky. "Who are you?" I whispered to myself, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. Then the truck's blindingly bright LED high beams flared to life. The sudden, intense light flooded the cabin of my SUV, blinding me in the rearview mirror. I threw my arm up to shield my eyes. Through the harsh glare, I heard the heavy metallic sound of the truck's doors opening. Two tall figures stepped out into the dust. They were wearing dark, baggy clothes. One of them had a bandana pulled up over the lower half of his face. The other was wearing a faded hunting cap pulled low over his eyes. And the man with the bandana was holding something long and metallic in his right hand. It looked like a heavy tire iron or the barrel of a shotgun. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They just started walking slowly, purposefully toward the rear of my car. They had done this before. I couldn't go backwards. The truck was too heavy. If I rammed it, I would total my radiator and entrap myself. I looked forward. The chain was too thick to break. My eyes darted to the right side of the dirt road. Beyond the edge of the path was a steep, rocky ditch, overgrown with heavy, thorny desert brush. It looked like a 4-foot drop into the dirt. If it was too deep, my SUV would get stuck in the mud and rock. I would be completely trapped, a sitting duck for the two men approaching my rear bumper. But it was my only chance. The men were only 10 feet away from my trunk now. The man with the metal object raised his arm. I didn't think, I just reacted. I shifted the gear into drive, cranked the steering wheel violently to the right, and slammed my foot down on the gas pedal with everything I had. The engine roared to life. It lunged forward, plunging off the safety of the dirt road and diving headfirst into the steep ditch. The front bumper smashed into the dense sagebrush with a deafening, sickening crunch of plastic and fiberglass. The entire car tilted violently to the side. For a terrifying, weightless second, I thought the car was going to roll completely over onto its roof. My head slammed against the driver's side window. But the tires, thank God they were brand new all-terrain tires, found traction in the loose dirt. I kept my foot pinned to the floor. The engine screamed. The underside of my SUV violently scraped against large rocks, a horrific shrieking sound of metal on stone. The SUV tore through the heavy brush, clawing its way along the side of the ditch, completely bypassing the wooden pole and the heavy chain. With one final violent lurch, the front tires caught the edge of the dirt road on the other side of the barricade, and the car launched itself back up onto the path. I fishtailed wildly in the loose gravel, fought to straighten the wheel, and sped forward into the darkness. I glanced in my rearview mirror one last time. The red glow of my taillights illuminated the two men standing by the chain, watching my dust trail disappear into the night. They didn't even run back to their truck to chase me. They knew I had made it out. I didn't take my foot off the gas. I drove at reckless speeds down that unmapped dirt road for another 20 miles until the sky finally started turning a bruised purple in the east and the dirt gave way to pavement. I finally merged onto a major populated state highway just as the sun broke over the horizon. I pulled into a brightly lit, busy truck stop, my hands shaking so violently I could barely put the car in park. I stepped out to inspect the damage. The entire front passenger side bumper was cracked and hanging off its clips. The side panels were covered in deep, jagged scratches from the desert brush. But that wasn't what made my stomach drop. That wasn't what made me lean against the hood of my car and dry heave onto the concrete. I walked around to the rear driver's side tire. Embedded deep into the thick rubber tread, missing the sidewall by less than half an inch, was a heavy welded steel spike, a homemade caltrop. If I had hesitated back there by the chain for even 5 more seconds, if I had backed up just 2 more feet toward their truck, that spike would have punctured my tire.
I never would have made it out of that ditch. And that's when the most horrifying realization of the entire night finally hit me. The detour on my GPS. It wasn't a satellite error. It wasn't a glitch. Someone out in that desert was intentionally setting up a localized signal spoofer. They were hacking the navigation systems of solitary drivers on the interstate, creating fake road closures and funneling them down a dead-end dirt road in the middle of the night, straight into a trap. I reported it to the highway patrol, but the area was so remote and the jurisdiction was so murky, I don't know if they ever found the men, or the truck, or the chain. I never drive cross-country at night anymore, and I never, ever trust the detour. Thank you for listening to tonight's stories. There's a strange, unsettling comfort in the dark, but as these stories prove, sometimes the things hiding in the dark are entirely real. If these experiences kept you awake tonight, please leave a like on the video. It helps the channel grow and tells the algorithm that you want more dark, realistic stories just like these. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with a friend who loves the thrill of late-night horror. And don't forget to let me know in the comments below which of tonight's stories terrified you the most. Have you ever taken a detour that felt wrong? I read every single comment. Lock your doors, trust your instincts, and until next time, stay safe out there.